Welcome to episode 2 of Pilot Kimberly. I've just returned from Lake Keepit, where I participated in Women in Gliding Week with a bunch of other women, just having fun gliding, setting ourselves some tasks and generally having a good time. Now Lake Keepit will be the scene of the next Women's World Gliding Championships. I had hoped to be there for the entire championships, and as I mentioned last episode, that wasn't going to happen due to work. But as it turns out now, my project is going to allow me just a little bit of time in the early part of the competition to be at Lake Keepit. So I am looking forward to bringing you some video and some content from the Women's Worlds. Although I won't be able to be there for the entire event, I hope that I'll be able to bring you something of interest. Now, what I want to talk to you about this episode is why gliding is really important and why every pilot should consider some gliding. And I'll do that by telling the story of some of my flying. But for those of you who haven't participated in gliding before and don't know anything about it, take a look at the Soaring Sisters YouTube channel and have a look at some of the videos there, the short videos that I've posted from the Women in Gliding Week. Lots of people have this idea that gliding is a bit like a sled ride. You get towed up and you glide down and that's it. But in actual fact, that's not what it's like at all. Gliding can actually involve quite long flights. In fact, there was a flight done while we were at Women in Gliding Week by two gentlemen of some 870 kilometers. Myself and another woman attempted a 500 kilometer flight and managed 300 before a storm shut down the day and we outlanded at a disused airport. And some days later I did manage to complete a 300 kilometer flight. So gliding can be some quite long flights. But why am I recommending that all powered pilots take up some gliding? Well, predominantly it's because gliding is stick and rudder type flying. The kind of flying that really allows you to build your skills and your judgment. We fly on attitude and we're really busy with mental tasks. And that can really help you when you're flying powered. It's quite a task to be flying long distances across country, concentrating on where your next thermal is going to come from, how soon you're going to leave that thermal, what your path through the next few kilometers is going to be, depending on what you see in front of you, while also looking at the ground and saying, that's where I'll land if I have to, that's where I'll land if I have to, and why. That paddock's facing the wind, that paddock's up a hill, that one's ploughed, that one has stubble. So all of these things, are going on in your mind while you're actually flying. But also the flying on attitude and the stick and rudder kind of control that's required to fly gliders is really useful to powered pilots in developing their skills. It's not just about judging things like glide angles and so being able to better do things like glide approaches or engine outs and things like that. But it's also the kind of coordination that's required to fly a glider. What probably some of you don't realize is, unlike a powered plane where you can pretty much leave your feet on the floor if you want to, in a glider you have to use the rudder pedals. You don't have any choice. The wings on a glider are quite long and they're therefore fairly long levers and exert quite a bit of force. So when you increase the lift on one wing by rolling or deflecting an aileron, what you actually do is you create drag on that side, which creates adverse yaw. So instead of the glider just rolling and turning into the turn, it rolls but turns the other way momentarily. And in gliding, that's very inefficient. It also can be dangerous, particularly at low speeds or when you're entering thermals where you're getting updrafts. So you have to be on the pedals all the time. And if you look at gliders in flight, you'll see a string on the canopy, a little piece of red wool usually, taped to the front of the canopy, right in the center. That's a yaw string, and that tells us whether or not our nose is pointing straight in the airflow. That's because we want to be as efficient as possible, but we also want to be as coordinated as possible. Now, while I say that, you will often see that string moving around a little bit. That's hard to avoid when you're in strong thermals. Also, some of us tend to fly with a little bit of what's called top rudder, and I will take some time to explain why we do that in another episode. But it's about the efficiency of flying versus the way the airflow comes across the canopy when you're turning. We'll have a look at that maybe in another episode. Nonetheless, the yaw string is probably, well, it's definitely the cheapest instrument in the glider, but it's probably one of the most important. And that use of rudder pedals coordinated with the stick is something that really helps your flying, along with all of the other judgment that's required for gliding. So I was going to tell you a little bit about what that meant from my personal story. So I have to go back quite a few years, about 14 or 15 years ago. I tried out for the Army. In fact, a friend of mine was a major on the pilot selection panel. He flew helicopters for the Army. And he told me that the Australian Army and the Navy had actually raised the age limits for pilots. At the time that he spoke to me, I was 40 years of age. And they'd raised the age, I think, to 48 or 48 and a half years or something like that. So I immediately started to apply. Now, it took about 3 years for them to put me through the process, in part because they'd never had anyone my age apply. And so I was 43 by the time I was successful, and I went off to the pilot selection session. I can't remember exactly, I think it was 14 days, and there were teams of 7 from my recollection. I can't exactly remember, but anyway, about 6,000 people applied, and something like 14 of us got to go. So that was pretty exciting time. And they don't do pilot selection this way anymore, so I feel quite safe talking about it now. We were actually sworn to secrecy shortly after we left the course, that we weren't to talk about what happened on course. But since they don't select pilots this way anymore, I feel quite safe speaking about it. What happened at that particular course was, on the first day we went into a 5-hour theory session. We sat in a mini kind of lecture hall, and we had a couple of pilots speak to us and tell us all the theory stuff that we needed to know in order to fly the aircraft and to understand the forces that were acting on the aircraft and so forth. So we learned about things like the wing loading effect on the stall speed and all those kinds of things, and the equations involved and everything else. Now, what they said to us after that session, or during that session, was, you now know all you need to know to do this so-called course, although it's really just selection. So if you have a question, you better ask it. And it really sets you up for a competitive process. What they're trying to do is see who it is that can raise to the top through the process that they use, so that they find out who it is who's going to learn the quickest and be the cheapest to train, and therefore also likely to be the most successful. So it's essentially a competitive process where the lowest scored person's document goes on the bottom, the highest scoring person's document goes on the top, and they keep doing that every day, and then eventually they pull so many off the top and you're the lucky people. Now, as it turns out, I was one of the lucky people. I was offered a position. I was 43 years of age, and I knocked it back, and we might talk about that some later episode about why I did knock that back. But let's for the moment talk about what the impact of my gliding history had been, and why the Army treated me the way that they actually did. Now, as far as I know, I'm still the oldest person to ever have successfully completed the pilot and officer selection via that process. Now, I don't know what's happened since that process ended, except to say they don't use it anymore. It's all done on computers. So we got to do that 5-hour training session. Then we got a allotted into a class. There were two classes. There was the normal class and then there was the advanced class. Now, before you went to that course, they told you that you needed 20 hours to make it to the advanced class. So all of those pilots who had 20 hours would be in the advanced class, and all of those pilots who had less than 20 hours would be in the basic class. Now, I had something like 165 hours of gliding, but I only had, I think, 8 hours or 8.5 hours of power time. And I'll tell you a little bit how that power time was accrued. I realised that I was going to have some power time if I wanted to convince the Army that I was interested in being a pilot. So I started training, and I initially started in a Gazelle, Skyfox Gazelle, and then moved on to a 152 and then a 172, and then a PA-28 and so on and so on. But when I started off, the instructor looked at my gliding history and went, "Oh, wow, you've got quite a bit of gliding time." Not that 165 hours is quite a bit of time, but he felt it was. And I had also been a flying instructor. In fact, I was the chief flying instructor of my club at that time. So a level 2 instructor, so I'd gone through 2 levels of instructing. Now, he said to me, "Let's go out and see what you can do, because you might find that you can do this quite quickly." So I went and did the entire syllabus in a single flight, including engine out on takeoff and a whole bunch of emergency procedures and everything else. So after completing the full syllabus in a single flight, he said to me, "You're ready to go solo, but I'm not allowed to send you." I think at the time Australian law said you had to have 2.5 hours of flight time, instructing time, before you could go solo. So he said, "You'll have to come back for another flight," which I did. And on that flight he pulled the engine out on me on a 152, I think it was, and we happened to be nearby an airport out in the country, near the training area, and so I set myself up for a circuit for that airstrip, and I found myself a little high, not being familiar with that particular aircraft, and so I remember saying to him, "Do these things side slip?" And he said, "Yeah." And so I, with full flaps, I side slipped the thing in. We got, maybe 100 feet off the deck, and he pushed the throttles and away we went, and he said, "I don't think I've ever seen a student side slip a 152 on their second flight." But that's one of the skills that you learn in gliding. Now be careful, not all aircraft can side slip, and that's why I asked the question first. In fact, my particular glider, if you try to side slip that, you'll find yourself on the ground nose first quite suddenly if you're low. So not a good idea to side slip an aircraft unless you know that it can be done. But those of you who know the Kimberly glider story, the story of, I think it was the 737 that landed on a drag strip, and if you don't know that story, go check it out. You'll know that pilot side slipped that particular aircraft, and he had quite a bit of gliding experience. So that was my introduction to powered. I did go solo at 2.5 hours. I did a few more flights and obviously got the 8.5 or whatever it was that I had when I went to the military selection process. And when we went to split up into two classes, one of the officers said to me, "Olsen, you're in the advanced class." And I remember saying something along the lines of, "Oh, why, sir? I've only got to 8.5 hours of power time, and you're supposed to have 20 to go in the advanced class." He said, "Yes, but you've got 165 hours in a glider, and you're an instructor, so you're going in the advanced class." Now, what that meant was, I was going to fly a Mudri Cap 10, a tail dragger, and quite a beast of a tail dragger too. Those of you who've flown them will know that they're quite a footful. They're not that easy to handle. So obviously the Army had a great deal of respect for gliding time. So how did I go in that Mudri Cap 10? Well, interestingly, we had these kind of open hangars. They were just a roof, fairly common in Australia, where you've got lots and lots of aircraft. So we had, a whole bunch of, I think 6 Mudri Cap 10s under this roof with no walls. And as I taxied out on that first taxi, the very first time I'd ever put my feet on the rudder pedals of a Cap 10. I came out of the roof line and immediately ground looped on the taxiway. The instructor said absolutely nothing, and I proceeded to resolve the issue, turned the aircraft around and taxied my way out. There's quite a long taxi in this place called Tamworth. And I taxied the aircraft all the way out, doing the proper procedure with the Cap 10, and off we went on our first flights. And our sorties at that course in the Cap 10, we had done some CT4 work that I didn't mention in the first few days of the course. So we were in CT4s doing circuits for a little while, and then the advanced class went on to the Cap 10s. So what we did in the Cap 10s was aerobatics, and the way that it worked then was the instructor would say to you, come to my door at a certain time and I'll brief you on your sorties for today. So you do that, you'd stand outside the officer's door and he'd invite you in and he'd say, here's your sorties, and he'd hand you a piece of paper, take it away, come back in 15 minutes, ask me any questions you need to know. Okay, so you go away and you read it. Now, I can't remember if this is my first sortie or if it was my second or third, I can't remember, but I'll give you the example of this particular one. It said we were going to go by the standard visual departure from Tamworth over the ranges to the training area, which is over a place called Breezer, I think, from memory. It's a railway track and a highway intersect, which is great for doing aerobatics. And he said to me, the paper said that we'd be doing loops and barrel rolls. Now, loops I had done in a glider, barrel rolls I'd never done, and they're actually quite a dangerous manoeuvre to do if you get them wrong. In fact, one of the aerobatic teams for the Royal Australian Air Force were all killed, bar one pilot, I think, when a barrel roll went wrong. And it went wrong because they didn't come through the horizon enough before they rolled, and so the axis of the roll was downwards and they speed into the ground. Now, off we went and we did those sorties, and as I said, I managed to get through and pass. It was really an eye-opener for me. We did all kinds of things, lots of UA work, lots of aerobatics, and of course lots of touch and goes with the tail dragger. And not only did the Army consider gliding to be really valuable in, obviously by deciding that I'd go into the advanced class, I found gliding really valuable in my ability to handle that aircraft with only 8.5 hours of power time, all in tricycle aircraft. So, and as far as I know, the military still considers gliding to be great training. I would encourage all of you to take up gliding, at least, go and do what's called your C certificate. So you go solo, then you do an A and a B and a C certificate. Ideally go and do your Silver C, which requires a 50-kilometre flight, 5 hours duration flight, and I think 1,000 metres. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. 1,000 metres height gain. So, I really would encourage everybody to go and do some gliding. I want to move on now to personal minima, and I'm going to show you some videos of some weather recently and talk to you about this notion of go or no go and whether or not you feel up to flying on that day or the conditions are too much for you or whatever. As I probably mentioned in episode 1, I recently returned to gliding after 3 years off, I think, and 2 years prior to that I was sort of a little bit here and there. So it's probably 5 years since I did any really serious gliding, and that included competitions and lots of instructing. So I'm not, well, I wouldn't have been what I call very current. I am now. I've got more than 40 hours in the last probably 6 months. So, I would consider myself quite current, but I'm also at a quite dangerous level in that I have about 430 hours of gliding, which makes me think I'm quite safe when probably I'm not. You have to be a little bit careful when your hours start to build up and you think, oh, I'm cool, I'm right. And, you tend to start making mistakes that you would make as a beginner. So it's really important that you start to, really think about your flying, even as your hours start to build. My little story that I'm going to tell you about personal minima, and I'll see if I can play the video for you, perhaps without sound, because I'm pointing out all my landing spots to myself mentally as I'm going through the flight. Anyway, that's okay. That's my past instructor coming out, used to telling the students what I'm thinking. So, what happened? I have a glider that's not very happy with crosswinds. It has what's called a chin hook. So the hook for aeroto is not right at the nose, it's partly underneath. Now it's not a centre of gravity hook or a CG hook like some gliders have, it's forward of that. But still, what happens is if you get a little sideways, it tends to keep wanting to pull you sideways. It doesn't self-correct like a nose hook does. So you've got to be careful in crosswinds. At this particular gliding club, the preference is to take off downhill and land uphill, obviously. And that equates to quite a bit of tailwind equivalence, if you like. So in other words, you can put up with a bit of a tailwind as long as you're landing uphill, for instance. Now in this particular case, we were about to take off and it was a quartering tailwind. They're always a bad idea, but I felt up to the task on this particular day, and so off we went. Now what's wrong with a quartering tailwind is pretty obvious to anyone who's a pilot, but what's wrong with it specifically with respect to gliding, it gets rather interesting. It's the same for powered aircraft as well, but for gliding I think there's an extra layer there in terms of the cable breaking between yourself and the powered aircraft. Think about this for a minute. I've got a quartering tailwind, I'm about to take off, it's going to be unstable for a little while, I'm going to be in the prop wash of another aircraft, and then if something happens, I'm going to land downhill with a tailwind that's quartering. Probably not a good option. So while it might be all okay while everything's going well, you need to think ahead about what will happen if something goes wrong. And landing downhill with a tailwind in a glider, not really a good idea. Anyway, we successfully got off the ground. We took most of the runway, we cleared the fence much lower than normal, and I didn't have the option to turn back and land up the hill because I didn't have sufficient height to even make a 45-degree turn, let alone a 180-degree turn or more. It actually took a full 3 minutes to get to a height where I could turn back. We are actually flying in rota. There's quite a hilly area where I fly, and at one point the tug just stepped sideways like that, and I was looking at the side of the tug, so I was completely out of station and had to get myself back around behind the tug, just from the change in wind direction and the rotor that was going on. So I was on climb, thinking to myself, note to self, don't ever do this again. A few weeks later, I'm at the same airfield, and I had been doing quite a bit more flying, but I'd driven up from Sydney some hours, about 3 hours drive. I was feeling really tired. I started to do some checks on my glider because it had just recently come out of its annual inspection, during which time authorised people had fitted a new disc brake, a Behringer wheel with a disc brake, and as it turns out, that modification didn't quite go as planned, and there were some issues with it. So I ended up having to dig around and find some airworthiness people and get them to look at it, and I had to, contort my body into odd shapes to try and get in there and remove some of the offending bits and pieces that were creating the issues. With the approval of the airworthiness people that were there and so on. I wasn't doing this unapproved, but I felt really tired after that, and the wind started to come up, and at that point in time I said, do you know what, I'd love to fly today, but I don't need to fly today. And I think I should have applied that same kind of process to the quartering tailwind day, and I didn't. Fortunately, I got away with it that time, but it did start me thinking about personal minimums and how we should, not be pressured or feel pressured to actually get a flight in just because we've driven 3 hours to our local operation, whether powered or gliding. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with a little bit of footage from the Women in Gliding Week. Not the most flattering angle. Sometimes the camera angle in the glider isn't the most flattering because I'm all scrunched up with the parachute on and everything else. But I'll leave you with some of that footage, and we'll talk to you next time that we are on air.